Hello, everyone.
Hello, good morning, or good afternoon if you're in Bucharest. Welcome to today's webinar with the British Main Chamber of Commerce. I'm Neil McGregor, the chairman of the Chamber, and I'm speaking to you from Bucharest. Today is going to be a first for the Chamber. Up to now, we've had many of these online events that have been very successful, and they've shown the ability of the Chamber to reach members and potential members, be they in all parts of Romania, all parts of the UK, and also further afield. But today will be the first webinar where our speaker is speaking to us not only from England, but also from quarantine in England. And we're very pleased to welcome Andrew Taylor. I'm just going to put in the link to the Chamber's website with the profile about today's webinar in your chat box, which you should see coming up before you there. So this is about leading in complex times. Now, I think it is very hard to argue that these are not complex times. I think Andrew, who I've known for quite a lot of years, whose work in education in Romania, is going to be a very good person to give us a view about how things have changed. Now, as you'll see from the presentation on the Chamber's webpage, Andrew is a senior lecturer in leadership and change at the University of Staffordshire, and he's also the managing director of Connect CEE, and is also involved in the Transylvanian Executive Education up in Cluj-Napoca. So this really exemplifies what the Chamber is trying to do in give access to interesting speakers who are as relevant in the UK as they are in Romania and in other parts of the world. A few points of administration. We are recording today's session, and also we are live on Facebook. If you're watching us live on Facebook, I'm not aware of any way in which you can send us questions. So think about logging into this platform on Zoom. If you have questions for Andrew, please enter them in the chat box, which I'll write a message here. It may be that some of your questions will be answered as Andrew continues his presentation, but if not, Anna will kindly put all these questions to Andrew at the end of his presentation. So that's enough from me. Andrew, we look forward to hearing what you have to say about leadership in complex times. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Neil. Can everybody hear me before we start?
Yes. Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes.
I apologise in advance for that. But anyway, let's get started on this. So what I want to talk a little bit about today is two sort of key areas, really. One is I'd like to talk about the way that technology and globalisation have converged to change the way that value is created and the way we should think about strategy. And the reason I've chosen to do this is because the reaction to the COVID pandemic that we're all living through has clearly been to rely much more heavily on the use of technology. And it's clearly had a huge impact on certain sectors, for example, retail. The mere fact that we're all here on Zoom making this work is a perfect example of why this matters. And clearly, the usual barriers of resistance to technological change have just been pushed aside because of the absence of alternatives through this crisis. So what I'm going to try to do to start with is take you through a series of Harvard Business Review articles that take you in chronological order and explain to you some of the ways in which that value creation process has been changed by that convergence of technology and globalization. And in the second part, what I'll try and do is provide you some tools, also linking to Harvard Business Review articles, so that you can then have the hardware available for you to actually think about how you and your business and your organization might be able to adapt and thrive and flourish within this emerging space and manage disruption more effectively. I've deliberately chosen to follow Harvard Business Review articles, principally because this enables you to go and find out more simply by going to the HBR site and finding the relevant article. And I've also, in the slides, tried to put references to the author and some of the titles to those articles to make that easier for you. Okay, so without further ado, if you could go to slide 2, please. Okay, so historically, the guru of strategy has always been Michael Porter in recent times. And Michael Porter is, of course, extremely famous for his model of strategy around 5 forces. And what this does is it provides a kind of structured way that managers and executives can think about how to construct a competitive position with the information they have available, and to help them think about what information they might need to develop a meaningful business strategy. The underlying and implicit assumption of Michael Porter was that value is held within business processes or was held within the products a business produced with those processes. And 5 forces was a model to help people protect, enhance, and create value in those spaces. But as technology moved on, Michael Porter came to realize himself that technology could actually make this even more effective. And what it gave rise to was something called business process reengineering. The idea that we could change the way we create value to make it more efficient. But in time, even that became challenged. And if we could go to slide 3, please. And in this case, what we see is Hamel writing in Harvard Business Review a famous article that he called "Don't Re-Engineer, Obliterate." And what he argued was that the process of business process re-engineering was wrong, on the basis that we shouldn't try to simply improve existing processes using technology, we should smash them. In doing so, technology offered the opportunity for dramatic improvements in performance. And what he actually suggested as an example was the example of Ford, who famously reduced their headcount of accounts payable clerks by something like 75%. And they did this because if you think about it, in the past, when you went to buy a car, what you did was you would arrive at the garage, the salesperson would write down the order, that order would be given to a clerk, that clerk would give that to the head clerk within that particular garage, they would be collected up, they would be sent probably by post to the regional centre, who would then send it to the national centre, who would then collect all these orders up, put them into some kind of table, and don't forget this would be manually, not on a computer, and then they would be sent over to America. Now, having a computer could speed this process up, but what Hamel was suggesting was, why don't we just get the salesperson to punch this into a computer that's connected to the internet, and that would go straight to America and cut everything else out. Now, clearly, there's a step change in the level of efficiencies and opportunities created here by doing this. And that's really what Gary Hamel wanted to capture. But it went further than this. And if we could go to slide 4, please. So here we see Arthur arguing that not only has the convergence of technology and globalization changed the efficiency of how we create value, it's actually changed and continues to change the basic laws of economics. And one of the most basic laws of economics is the law of diminishing returns. And for those of you that don't know, I'll explain it to you the way it was explained to me by my economics teacher when I was 17. So what he said was, if you imagine it's a hot summer's day and we're all sat outside a pub, and of course this was deeply appealing when I was 17. He says, and we order a beer. The first beer is very refreshing because it's cold and it's a hot day. The second beer is quite good, but not as good as the first. The third beer is okay, and by the time we've got to the fourth, it really doesn't matter anymore. That's the law of diminishing returns. But what Arthur said was that in tech, where markets are disrupted by technology, the law of diminishing returns doesn't apply. In fact, that which gets ahead is likely to get further ahead. Markets where technology disrupts are in equilibrium in a monopolistic state of competition. where there is typically between 1 to 3 key players. This is not a situation where markets become more competitive over time. They actually become less competitive. And if you think about it, for example, at one time there was Friends Reunited, there was MySpace, there was Facebook. Now, Friends Reunited and MySpace no longer exists. How many operating systems for computers are there in the world? How many operating systems for mobile phones are there in the world? And this is occurring because, and if we can go to slide 5, please. This is because of what Arthur calls grooving. And grooving is about 2 key things. First is technological grooving. And that is because in order to be able to share and collaborate with other people in a digital space, we have to have a technological standard that we can share. And whoever gains control of this is really gaining a form of customer lock-in. For those of you that are my age, you'll remember video recorders. When they came in, there were really 2 types. There was VHS and Betamax. Betamax was actually a higher quality of product. But Sony, who pioneered the production of these devices, decided they would go for VHS. And the result was that VHS became the standard. In the computer space, Office software, in the early days, there were many different types. There was Lotus Office, Lotus Notes, there was WordPerfect, there was Microsoft, there were many. But the need to collaborate forced consumers toward the Microsoft product. And the use of their .doc format is what has enabled them to keep a stranglehold on that space ever since. But there's also a social form of grooving. And that is because learning to use new technology is difficult. It's not fun. I mean, it's fun if you're like, 14, 15, it's kind of fun. But when you're trying to do it at my age, or you're trying to do it in a busy business environment, it's not fun. You want to do it once, make sure it works. And you don't want to be having 2 different social media accounts. Do you really want a Facebook and a MySpace account? Do you really want to be using both Android, Apple, and then maybe Microsoft systems? No, you want to keep it simple. And so the result is there is both a technological and a social pressure to converge on one particular system, one particular technological tool. And that occurs throughout markets. And of course, what tech companies try to do is to bridge those advantages into new markets. So of course, Microsoft famously tried to get into to bridge their tech advantage in Office software into mobile phone systems. It didn't work for them. Apple tried to do the same into their mobile systems, and it worked extremely well, to the point where the computer operating system kind of followed later. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The result of this, Arthur argues, is that in the tech economy, wherever technology disrupts marketplaces, adaptation is what drives increasing returns businesses, not optimization. In other words, managing for efficiency is a mistake. In the tech economy, management is more like surfing, in the sense that it's about trying to see the next big wave and position yourself in the right place to be able to catch it. It isn't about trying to create order and efficiency. This is a key change. Right? The manager's ability to control and optimize and efficient processes internally doesn't really work. And the reason is because the locus of value creation is being shifted out of business processes and out of the firm entirely, and is actually being positioned within a network. And thus the result is that value creation is contingent on a firm's ability to aggregate trust through a network. Think about Amazon. They don't write books, they don't produce books. They very often don't even distribute them. They have a third-party distributor. But what they do is aggregate trust. Okay. So this is key. And what it means is that the key skill of managers that are involved in strategy is not about efficiency. It's about critical thinking. it's about how do we look into the future and identify the key trends that will affect our ability to leverage new business. And that's very different from the kind of world that people like my parents' generation thought about was legitimate and effective management. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we're starting to see is the emergence of what Chris Anderson famously called the long tail economy. And in the long tail economy, we're seeing a shift. Wherever technology and globalization come down, to break the choice between richness and reach, and I'll come back to that, markets have tended to move away from a bell curve towards a Pareto curve that has much steeper sides and longer and higher tails. This is very, very important because this is a graphical representation of that tendency towards monopolistic competition. And what it means is that that competition for the mass market is much more of a do or die game. There isn't room for more than 2 to 3 winners. And that means that even very large firms have a very real chance of not winning in that space. And they may actually be better off competing in a niche in what's called the long tail. And I'll explain that in a moment. But just to give you an example of this, this is precisely why Microsoft were unsuccessful in competing in that mobile phone space. It was a do or die space. Okay. Now, Evans and Worcester famously said that this convergence of tech and globalization is allowing companies to have both richness and reach. So I just want to explain that briefly, because it's quite a big statement. In the world before the internet, companies had a choice. They could sell products to mass markets and go for reach, where they would sell a lot of volume on a relatively small margin. And if you think about it, these are companies like Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and typically the big consumer good companies. And what they would do is they would market products and say, this is what we have to offer. So here is our range of shampoos from the budget to the premium. Which would you like to buy? And then there were companies that competed on the basis of richness. And what they said was, we're going to sell a much smaller volume, but on a much larger margin. So an example of this might be the Body Shop. But what's happened as the internet has come in is that you no longer have to, as a consumer, have to put up with that. You can have both. All you have to do is go and click on eBay, and you can access pretty much any product from anywhere in the world at the lowest possible price. And this has revolutionized the way that companies have had to think about marketing. It's simply no good just saying to consumers, you must have a choice between our 5 products or Unilever's 5 products or Reckitt Benckiser's 5 products. You can actually exercise a choice of any other product from anywhere in the world. And what this means is that whilst those large companies continue to dominate that large mass market space, that mass market space is being squeezed from the sides by niches which are now global. If we can go to the next slide, please. So what you see is in the long tail economy, on the left-hand side of this graph, you see part of the mass market. And as you go along towards the right of the long tail, you see smaller and smaller niches. But of course, as we are able to access the entire world now, some of those niches are actually larger than former national markets. And so it can be a perfectly legitimate choice to actually deliberately compete in that space rather than the mass market. Okay, so this can be quite a powerful way forward. And a good example of this is a company like Tesla. And then ultimately, of course, they may end up disrupting that mass market too. So this is clearly very, very challenging and has caused huge disruption to many companies and continues to do so, to the point where some of them have simply gone under, for example, Nokia. So what I'd like to do now is just provide you with some tools to help you think about how you might be able to take advantage and compete effectively in a disrupted market. So the first slide I'd like to talk about, if we can go to slide 10, please, is Chris Argyris's learning loops model. This is very famous It's quite an old model, but when it appeared in Harvard Business Review, it had a very big impact. And what Chris Argyris argues is that there are two ways that people learn, and this has a huge impact on the organizational culture and the performance of organizations and individuals within them. And in single loop learning, what managers basically do is they ask the question, how do we do things right? And this drives a focus upon optimization and efficiency. In double loop learning, what managers do is ask the much more fundamental and challenging question, what are the right things? Now, theoretically, this makes a lot of sense. And what we would all like to do is to encourage fundamental questioning of our basic assumptions. But actually, in the real world, where there's time pressure to get things done, people who do that in meetings are very often very annoying to many other managers who just want to get on with stuff they've got to do and achieve the targets. However, if we're going to compete in a technologically disrupted environment, double loop learning is absolutely key. If we are not able to do that, the chances are that we will lose and we will be effectively disrupted by those organizations and individuals who are better able to take advantage of the opportunities disruption creates. I can't emphasize this enough. You know, as a consultant, whenever I go and look at companies and talk to people, single loop learning is one of the most clear and evident ways that the companies have problems. Let me give you some examples. We go to the next slide, please. So here are three examples. I won't name the companies, but the first example was a global accounting firm that I did some work with, and I asked them to read the Harvard Business Review article on learning loops by Chris Argyris and tell me what they thought about it, which they did. And their thought was, he must have spent time in our company because this is about us. This is what we do. And a realization that whilst they were talking to clients about double loop learning, what they themselves were actually doing was a perfect example of single loop learning. And you ended up with this kind of cognitive dissonance where what we say and what we do are two different things. And this was they realized that this was very important for two reasons. One is their own industry was actually going through a process of disruption and they weren't able to react to it. And they could see why. And the second reason was, frankly, if they continued to go about things the way they were, all that they would do is continue to drive what was already a high staff turnover rate, because people got sick of simply trying to reproduce best practice because it increasingly seemed irrelevant. And the reason was because they were experiencing disruption, best practice and the models of management that supported simply meant that people were working harder and harder, but the impact on their performance and the organization's performance was less and less. So another example of this was I worked for a major global technology company, we won't say which one, and I was asked to come along and have a look at a problem that they'd had from their employee survey. And that employee survey said in that particular year, as it had in many other years, that the two key problems they faced were work-life balance and interdepartmental cooperation. I'm sure these are common problems in many large firms all over the world. But this year, the headquarters of this company had decided they had to do something about it. So what they did was they identified change agents to work on this. And then the human resources department said, well, can you come and help them, Andy? So I came and had a look. And the first thing I said was, well, what are you planning to do now? And they said, well, what we're planning to do is we're going to change the internal computer system so that managers that keep people past 9 o'clock in the evening, they'll be moved from green to amber or maybe even red on our internal traffic light system. That's not good for your career, Andy. You don't want that. And the other thing is managers won't be able to sign off projects unless they've run it through other departments first on our system. And this will also force managers to cooperate because, again, if they fail to, they'll change on their traffic light. And that's bad news, Andy. So they said, what do you think about this then, Mr. Clever Consultant? To which I said, well, it doesn't really sound like a lot of fun, does it? And they were like, well, It's not meant to be fun, Andy. This is an office, it's a business. I said, yeah, you see, that's kind of the problem. So they said, okay, well, you're clever then. What do you think we should do? So I said, well, have you thought about hide and seek? Or, as you say in Romanian, vată răspunsă. And they're like, what are you talking about, Andy? And I said, well, I just think that if we were all to play hide and seek, we would actually get together and talk to each other as human beings, and it would be a lot more fun. So I played with them a team building game, and I asked them to get people from each department. And the game required people to talk to each other, listen and collaborate if they wanted to achieve performance. And it was also fun. They all seemed to like it. And when they left, I asked them if they'd like to do more of this, and they all said yes. So the next morning, I've gone away, and the human resources manager called me and said, Andy, what do you think you're doing? You're going to get me fired. I said, why? What have I done? I said, I've got an official recommendation here that the solution to our problems that we have to report to our global board about is to play hide and seek in the office, Andy. I'm going to get fired. I've paid a consultant for this. So I said, right, well, let me know how you get on. So this was presented at the end of the local board meeting in Romania as part of any other business, to which the general manager said, this is brilliant. Let's play now. And they did play now. And as predicted, the general manager chose to hide under the receptionist's desk. If the general manager is hiding under the receptionist's desk, playing hide and seek, it kind of allows everybody else to play. And actually, the result of that project, and this was only, the catalyst to start it off really and get people talking, was that they had the fastest change in perceptions of work-life balance and interdepartmental cooperation of any of this company's subsidiaries on Earth. And I like to think that was a fundamental shift where they started to move away from single loop learning and towards double loop learning. The same kind of issue occurred in another company I was working for that was kind of a services company. And you can see on the slide some of the problems that they faced. And fairly dire problems, really. But people were so determined to hold on to the existing ways they knew to do things, they simply wouldn't change. And the result is, if that company fails to change, unfortunately, they're very likely to go out of business. And in fact, one of the things we did with that company was I introduced them to a lady called Professor Yasmin Morali, who works with another gentleman called Professor Dave Snowden. And then they talked to them about how you think about complexity in a slightly different way. And I'll explain that in a few minutes. But the interesting thing in this organization was they were so wedded to single loop learning that they simply rejected it as inefficient. And only time will tell where that organization ends up. I personally suspect that unless they do change, they'll simply crash. The indicators are not good. But nonetheless, let's have a little look at Dave Snowden's work on the Cynefin Framework. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, Dave Snowden's Cynefin Framework, I would suggest for many managers, and absolutely for those involved in strategy, is really, really good. And the reason it's so good is what it does is it asks managers to think about how they're framing the question before they rush for the right answer. The tendency when you're under time pressure is to look for best practice. And that's either best practice on the basis of what's worked before, or it's best practice of whatever industry standard is out there. But the nature of disruption is that industry standards are exactly what is under pressure. So what we need is a tool to help us understand the nature of the question before we think about how to go about answering it. And that's exactly what the Cynefin Framework does. And it does it very, very powerfully. So what I'd like to do, if we could now, is just show a short clip where Dave Snowden explains this far better than I ever will. And then we can just talk a little bit about how that's valuable and take it forward to some examples. So if you could just show that video clip for a few moments, please. Yeah, please, can we do something to adjust sound? I can't hear, and I don't think anybody else can quite hear that. If you could start it again with sound, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, just 1 second. No, I can share both the sound and the video for the moment.
So you're not able to share the sound, right?
Yeah, I can send the link of the video in the chat if people want to watch.
Okay, so what I suggest is the best way to solve this problem is if you can. The best solution might be if people. I suggest people watch that afterwards in their own time, and I'll just talk through a short summary of it. Would that be okay?
Yes, please. That's fine with me.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Okay, so if we can go back to the slides then, please. Okay, so I'll just talk you through this briefly. In the best practice space, what we tend to do is we look at a problem and go, oh yes, that's exactly what we know what that is. We'll apply what we already know, and we'll apply a solution to it. So essentially, to any reasonable person, this is fairly straightforward. You know, there is an obvious relationship between cause and effect, and it responds well to best practice. Problems like this respond well to best practice. In the complicated space, the relationship between cause and effect is there, but it's not always obvious to everybody. In order to effectively solve these kind of problems, what you need to do is you need a great deal of experience, or you need to call somebody else who has a great deal of experience. So that would be a consultant of some kind, typically. Okay, that's what that requires, instead of best practice, good practice. Right? There may well be more than one way to do this. In the complex space, what we have is there is a relationship between cause and effect, but it's not visible with anything but the benefit of hindsight. And in this situation, you have to deal with emergence, and you need emergent practice. And the problem we've got here is that in this space, problems do not respond to best practice, and they cannot be understood by experts so that they can be transformed into something that does respond to best practice. The nature of the problem is that we have to deal with emergence, and the best way to deal with emergence is to conduct what Snowden calls safe to fail experiments. And that is to say, they're experiments where we have, from the beginning, designed methods for expanding them if they work, and methods for dampening and stopping them if they start to produce failure. Right? And a simple example of why this matters, if you look at the UK today, what you're seeing is that the government has totally messed up their approach to examination results for 16 and 18-year-olds as they try to manage them through the COVID crisis, where students aren't taking exams. And the reason is simple, because what they've tried to do is apply some form of best practice by bringing in experts who can reduce it to best practice, when in reality the problem is actually a complex one. And the difficulty is if we get this wrong and we allocate the problem to the wrong space, what we're likely to end up with is falling into the chaotic space. And in the chaotic space, there is a complete breakdown between cause and effect quite often. And in here, what we need to do is we need to seize control and act quickly. So this is very different. And as Dave Snowden says, this is where the fascists seized control. The difficulty we face is knowing which space we're in, when in reality, we're quite often in that space in the middle, in that little grey diamond of disorder, where we don't actually know which space we're in. And what managers do, because they're very often under time pressure, is rush to what they know and try to stuff it into the best practice box. And the problem that occurred in the last example we talked about of the services company was that was exactly what people were doing. Good management and good work was defined as hard work. So what people did was try to show how hard they worked by doing as much as possible. And in a world where everything is stable and responds to best practice, that works well because efficiency is an effective tool. The difficulty is that doesn't work very well in markets that are being disrupted. Right? That turbulence mitigates against best practice. And what happens in those situations is, as people work harder and harder, what they end up doing is trying to slow down the momentum of this beast as it crashes away from the simple space and into the chaotic space. And that line between simple and chaotic is not the same as any other. That line is actually a cliff rather than a simple line. And you drop off that cliff at your peril. Recovery, as you fall from the simple to the chaotic space, is extremely expensive, if it's possible at all. And very often it isn't. And this is precisely what happened to Nokia. It's precisely what Microsoft were deeply concerned about happening. And it's also what happened, almost happened at Apple before Steve Jobs came back. Understanding which space you're in is actually key. But to do that, we need space to think. And we need to have the analytical tools and the critical thinking ability to be able to pull those tools together. So what I've tried to do today is give you tools to start with to think about how the shift in value creation has taken place, to use double loop learning to help you think about the need to ask that double loop learning question, what are the right things? The Cynefin Framework offers the means for you to structure the search for the nature of the question and the right sort of people, because different people tend to be suited for different boxes. So in the best practice box, those efficiency type managers who are just able to suck up huge amounts of work and get it done are very good. That complicated space requires genuine depth of expertise and experience. But in the complex space requires a very different kind of person. You know, a good example of people that are natural complexity workers are people like battlefield commanders who need to assemble large amounts of very emergent data and make judgments quite quickly. Okay, so that's what we try to do. And just before we finish, what I'd like to do is just talk to you about one more tool, which I hope helps anchor some of this thinking within your own organization so you can apply it more effectively. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so in this space, we have another Harvard Business Review article by a couple of people called Prahalad and Hamel. And what they wrote about was core competencies. Now, what their argument was that in times of disruption, what organizations can do most effectively is think about not the things that they do today, but the core competencies that underlie those things. So the three key core characteristics of a core competency are: they need to provide access to a wide variety of markets. They should make a significant contribution to the perceived customer benefits of the end product, and they should be difficult for competitors to copy. They're not the same thing as the products that you actually make, though. They're the things that make your products appealing and valuable in multiple spaces. And if you're not sure about this, a good way to find out is to ask people like employers, customers, suppliers, what they think the core competencies are. They are the source of how you create value. The things that you do for customers better than your competitors. And knowing these things are key to thinking about how you can apply them using new technologies in new markets and thus adapt rather than simply optimize what we already do. So what we really want to be able to do is to combine an understanding of what our core competencies actually are with that double loop learning and that Cynefin framework to be able to say, well, how will we leverage these opportunities? Okay. And some examples, if we can go to the next slide, of people that do this. Okay, so Apple famously did this by redefining quality. You know, when we think about quality in computers, what we used to think about was production quality, hardware quality, software quality, in terms of reliability and these kinds of things. But what Apple did was say, well, actually, our core competence isn't about those things. Our core competence is around it's so easy to use. You only have to click once. It's so intuitive. It's not kind of neat and tidily structured in a mathematical way like a Microsoft machine. It's an aesthetic. It's beautiful. Understanding that is what has driven Apple and enabled them to leverage those two core competencies into a whole set of new marketplaces. You know, the iPhone, the iMac, all of these things, from a technological point of view, were very often not better than anything that anybody else offered. And many times they were actually worse. However, they were easy to use and they were more beautiful, more aesthetically pleasing. They understood that there's a financial value that can be attached to that. And what Apple realized was that, in fact, we're not really a manufacturing company at all. We are the world's biggest design company. And what we should do is get rid of manufacturing and outsource it. Now, the idea at the time that you would outsource manufacturing as a computer hardware company must have seemed insane. But that's exactly what they did. And the results speak for themselves. A simple another example is a telco company called 3.co.uk. And they're a mobile operator like Vodafone or Orange or Digi or any of those. But when they first started, their big pitch was that we're not a telecoms company, we're an internet service provider. And that kind of seems strange because they do provide access for my mobile phone to make phone calls. But actually what they did that was pioneering at the time was they said that if you have 1 British pence of credit, you have unlimited access to Skype. We aren't a telecoms company, we're a pipeline to the internet. And when you think about that, that's quite revolutionary, really. What they said was, we are a telecoms company that embraces technology. Telco is yesterday. Consumers don't want that. What they want is a reliable mobile pipeline to the net. And of course, that's exactly where the market has gone. And 3 has emerged as a very powerful player in the market and has been able to transfer their offering into multiple markets around the world in a market which really is quite cutthroat. Virgin is another one. They've been tremendously successful in leveraging that brand into numerous markets. You know, they started off with a music company, they've got an airline, they've gone into trains, they've gone into banking, a huge number of different consumer marketplaces. But what they're very clear about, the essence of Virgin is outstanding customer service. Wherever they look at a market and customer service is poor, think about trains, think about planes when they got into them, think about banking with all its recent scandals, they think this is potentially an opportunity. That doesn't mean they can go into it, because clearly we need to look at the business cases and the costs and barriers, but that is in itself an opportunity because their core competence is around a particular branded form of customer service. And understanding that allows them to leverage it as technology platforms change into new marketplaces. If we can go into the next slide, please. And this is really the final model that I hope pulls some of this together for you. Gavetti wrote an article about what he called associative thinking, the new psychology of leadership. And what he argued was that while managers are very good at identifying opportunities that are cognitively close to their existing business, managers that are managing businesses undergoing disruption need to learn to recognize similar underlying patterns in distant markets and make that leap. And the way that you do this is you understand your core competencies. You use the Cynefin Framework and double loop learning to say, what are the marketplaces that may not be obvious or close? Could we apply the same logic to? Where is the same dynamic taking place that our core competencies could create value? Fujifilm did this very, very famously, and they used something called the Ansoff matrix to structure associative thinking. So Fujifilm was a photographic filmmaker that went in and realized that the arrival of the digital camera was going to destroy their business. So what on earth are we going to do? So what they did was they said, well, what is our core competence? And their core competence was around very thin film-based chemistry. And they said, well, what other markets need those kind of competencies? And they decided to go into medical and telecom markets and have done enormously well as a result of doing so. And they use the Ansoff matrix as a way of structuring that. And I offer that to you because it is a very simple way of helping pull these different ideas together so that you start to think about how much risk you're taking on as you diversify into those new spaces too, so that we're very conscious about what it means to start thinking in complex ways about entering new marketplaces. Okay, so this is a very simple way of helping to create structure in a very unstructured space. And if we can go to the next slide, give you some simple examples of how this can work. Okay, so the first example I'll give you is one that's very familiar to me. When I first got involved with Transylvania Executive Education, it was really based on having a meeting, a sort of informal coffee meeting with Tibi Moyser, who is now the Deputy CEO of Bank of Transylvania. And he asked me where I thought business education was going. And I said, well, you know, to be honest, it's rather like airlines. It's nice that TAROM exists, but in the real world, TAROM is not going to survive unless it joins some kind of global alliance to co-chair and line up with those global brands. You know, it doesn't matter if it's One World or Star Alliance or any other, but it's not credible that they can survive alone. And business education is really going in the same way. You know, it's nice to have campuses all over the world, but in the real world, that's terribly expensive. And what students increasingly want as they become more and more brand aware is they would like to join and have an education from a globally recognized brand. And so what you really want to do is, if you're an emergent college and you'd like to be part of that, is what you should do is join a existing globally delivered product. And and he said, I like what you say, please could you come and talk to the dean at UBB? So I did, and we conducted a year-long search to find such a partner. And then we agreed a deal at that time with the University of Hull. And we rolled out their MBA, and we're now about to start our 7th class with about 150 students who are either in the program or have graduated. And really that came down to nothing more than a sort of core understanding of how we do some associative thinking and what core competencies we're actually looking for in order to take this forward. Another example in recent times with this pandemic is Dyson. Dyson, you may know, is the company that famously makes vacuum cleaners and hand dryers. Well, one of the things they did was, when this pandemic started, they rushed to offer the British government their knowledge to start making ventilators. And the reason that they did this was they said, well, our core competence is around innovative use of exactly the same technologies that ventilators use. But actually, if we do this at this time, this will be a fast-track way for us to get into medical marketplaces and use our innovative technology, where normally, because of the rules and regulations around medical products, it's very difficult to break into. So this presents not only an opportunity to do the right thing, but makes a great deal of business sense for us to open up new markets for us. L'Oreal made a similar decision, is that they said, well, you know, what we're going to do is go into products around hygiene, like hand sprays to disinfect and those sorts of things, because we've got exactly the technologies exactly within our core competence. But actually, we're a consumer brand. Getting into medical markets as a consumer brand is not straightforward. But this is a huge opportunity for us to leverage our capability in consumer trust to go into medical trust and open up that market opportunity for us. And that's exactly what they've tried to do. And there are a number of other companies who've made similar kinds of decisions very, very effectively. So what I hope I've been able to do for you today is provide you with some tools and some examples of how we need to think differently as technology and globalization converge to disrupt the marketplaces we're familiar with, and actually perceive and define our roles in those markets as opportunities and not just threats, but to recognize the threat as it actually is, so that we adjust the way we think in order to organize our businesses in an appropriate way for us to be successful. So I hope that was interesting, and thank you very much for your time. And are there any questions?
Andy, thank you very much indeed. That was an extremely interesting presentation. I know that Colin, Vice Chairman, Colin Lovering, has one question for you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Andy. Congratulations. Good to see you, my friend. I'm glad that you're well and fit and everything else. I just want to touch on. I was listening to you when you were talking about the, let's call it emotion, when you were talking about the example of consumers making emotional decisions, and you gave the nice examples with Apple, with Free, with Virgin, and I'm just thinking about the current situation with COVID, how I think that's released, if that's the right word, a lot of emotions into business. And really the question is how will managers and leaders incorporate this newfound emotion, which is probably going to stay with us, into the practical decision-making processes that you've highlighted today? What would be your advice?
So my advice would be, first of all, and it's a very good question, so thank you. My advice would be to start with the Cynefin Framework, because the tendency of particularly marketing and sales type managers will be to rush to what they know as best practice, because the situation is very dynamic, there's time pressure, they want to take advantage of a perceived market opportunity quickly. My advice would be to take a little bit of time and actually think about the nature of the change itself, rather than assume that it's going to be structured in the same way as previously. This is a situation where very likely that change is representing a shift from a bell curve to a Pareto curve in many consumer markets. And if in those markets may already have been shifting, so what's going to happen is it's going to accelerate that shift. So simply doing the same things we've done before is actually going to do no more than make us work harder, whilst actually reducing our competitive position without us really understanding why that's happening. So what we really should be doing is thinking perhaps about this as a complex space, because I think we can all agree that this is an emergent situation where relationships between cause and effect are not always obvious. And in that situation, what would be better to do is to set up safe to fail experiments. And if you think about what Dyson did with their ventilators, that's exactly what they did. I mean, they didn't say to us, we can guarantee we can do this in this amount of time to this standard of quality. They said, no, we're really good engineering innovators. We'll give this a shot, right? And if it works, we'll have a method for scaling this up really fast. And if it doesn't, we'll kill it. And we won't, there's no shame in that. And I think the more that managers can get comfortable with that way of looking at this situation, they're more likely to come out the other side successful. The challenge is that instead of picking a winner, managers need to get comfortable with managing a series of experiments in parallel. And if you think about it, the one thing that some governments have got right when they think about purchasing vaccine type programs is they've decided that they're going to risk losing money by buying multiple vaccines without actually having any proven results early on. And that's a perfect example of safe to fail experiments. Without that money, the vaccines can't be accelerated at the pace we would like, the development programs. But we also know that we have no guarantees which one will be successful. So what we need is a series of safe to fail experiments that allow us to expand rapidly the ones that work and kill the ones that are less successful. I hope that, is that a useful answer?
Yeah. Well, in fact, you answered another question, which I didn't ask as well, which I was thinking about asking you. So you kind of wrapped the two in there. And I think the point I was making was just on the decision making is how not so much that you talked about how the manager's making decisions there, which is very clear and great advice. So I'm just thinking how that manager conveys that decision making further down the line based on what I said about emotions. But I think you've kind of touched on that anyway. But that was the main sort of challenge I was putting, which I think is very relevant today at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, cheers, Andy.
I think I would say from the legal world, the question is sometimes more important than the answer, but in this case, both are important. Stian, I think you have a question.
Yes, I have. Hi, Andy. Very nice to see you. Very nice to listen to you as always. Hope all is well.
Yes, it is. And how's life in Norway?
Very well, very well, thank you. Very well. No, we're difficult times. Despite difficult times, we're keeping up okay. So we're very happy. And as always, very interesting to share your thoughts. And I think, as you say, the key to not just succeed, but to survive in these times is that identifying core competencies and how can we apply this to adapt into new times. But as an industry sector close to my heart, and as you know, and frequently reported on during these times, is of course the airline sector and tourism in general. And they're already worrying about the reduced numbers of passengers and revenue now come the autumn. What would your advice be for the travel and tourism sector?
Yeah, the travel and tourism sector is, of course, a perfect example of organizations trying to apply best practice and actually driving off the cliff into the chaotic space. There is no doubt that anybody involved in management strategy in an airline needs to get into that complex space right away. Yeah. And they need constructing those safe to fail experiments. Everything else is doomed. I mean, you only have to look at the communication disaster that is British Airways right now. And simply trying to apply what we've done before and sack all the staff and we'll hire them back on worse terms. Aside from whether it makes any economic sense, the PR disaster probably outweighs any economic saving. And so the goodwill that they're going to lose is disastrous. So those are clear examples of when it goes wrong. The difficulty is, what do you do? And of course, if I had the answer, I'm sure that Michael O'Leary would have me in Ireland right now, helping him make some more millions. But of course, we don't have all the answers to that, sadly. But what I can say is that model is that model where we all bought tickets incredibly cheaply and could fly wherever we liked without any cost or risk to anybody in particular. That is consigned to the bin for at least a medium term. So the question, if you are an airline, I would suggest to you is, what is that core competence that you have? And in the case of British Airways, you might well say, well, one of their core competencies historically has always been around outstanding kind of traditional British customer service. That idea, something rather old-fashioned and very reliable, right? So what are the markets where you could create value by leveraging that? I don't know what they are. You know, I might be able to figure it out if I had enough time. That isn't the same core competence that Michael O'Leary's people at Ryanair have. But there's no doubt that the core competencies that all of those have can be leveraged elsewhere. So the key question is, how do we do that and where do we do that? And it's those kind of discussions that I would suggest need to be taking place in boardrooms right now, rather than rushing to take actions which we may well regret later, and actually, certainly in the case of British Airways, look very likely to push them more towards the chaotic and disastrous space than anything else.
No, thank you. I think that's a very good answer for what. As to where any company in any sector needs to start. What are our competencies, core competencies? What are we good at, and where can we apply them? Another example, in addition, another example of companies being, in addition to Dyson or L'Oreal, was a small Norwegian gin manufacturer. They went from producing gin to producing disinfectant sprays, and they're being enormously successful in selling it chemists and supermarkets all across the country. They're even exporting, apparently.
That does sound like a perfect example.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
The example, I think, of Brewdog in the UK, who are a very well-known Scottish brewery, who have now moved into producing hand sanitizer.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Neil. You've got the idea precisely. You know, it's about understanding what your core competence is rather than your core product, and then saying, right, how could we leverage this? And what is the right way to define the question? Is it simply a question of, best practice? Does it require something else? How should we do it? And when they went into that space, there's probably a good chance that they ran some fairly safe to fail experiments rather than committed a big shift of production lines straight away.
I think
Or is that, Neil, is that because a lot of people in Scotland were drinking hand sanitizer anyway?
It's a disgusting suggestion, Colin.
No, I think also we have two members of the chamber. I don't think they're on the call today, but both are in the fashion garment industry, and both have moved into producing either face masks or PPE or other equipment, which is an excellent example, I think, of repurposing what you do to meet the current economic requirements. I hope
Yes,
I might get on a webinar for the members later on.
Yes, that's right. And one of the most interesting things that is going on in the garment industry is companies are making that shift. But then what they're starting to do, and you're beginning to see the signs of retailers that frankly have been trapped in that chaotic space as the whole business model collapses around them, and starting to say, well, how can we use that shift into, say, face masks from garments as a bridgehead to open up markets which might be difficult or non-traditional for us to access that go beyond garments. I mean, if we're in face masks, why are we not producing medical clothing, which normally is very regulated? And if we're doing that, why are we not thinking about what other things that we could do in medical markets where there's a higher value for us than deeply competitive fashion markets?
Exactly right.
Yeah, I have another question, if you don't mind, just on mixing the emotions and economics still. It's really about supply chain. What are your thoughts about supply chain going forward with COVID-19, with maybe the fears of buying products from certain parts of the world, together with the emotion of buying local, supporting the local economy, etc. How do you see supply chain globally unfolding through this crisis?
Right. Well, so this is a good example of the nature of disruption and how it affects some industries more than others. So products which are effectively replaceable with digital technology are being revolutionized, and this pandemic is the final nail in the coffin of some marketplaces. So what you're seeing, if you take, for example, music, it's a very interesting case, and then we'll come on to some other more physical products now that aren't disrupted. But in case of music, Paul Mason, his famous book, Post-Capitalism, I think it was published in 2016, talked about the way that markets are being disrupted as the marginal price of production and distribution closes in on zero. Right, so if you think about it, how much does it cost iTunes to get a song to you? Almost nothing. The only cost to them is the cost of the electricity for supporting the internet connection. Really, they have no other marginal cost. Right? So the thing is, in that situation, the opportunity to scale a business and create a Pareto market is absolutely phenomenal. That requires some complex thinking. Best practice won't get you into that space. That opportunity, the pandemic, has kind of turbocharged. But what we also know is, whilst that is very true of the mass market, there is this kind of weird group of people in niche markets that have suddenly decided they want to buy old-fashioned records. Sorry, someone was having a conversation. And so, yeah, the thing is, that presents a niche market. But what we need to do is, as a manufacturer of records, we would need to think very carefully about how we address that niche market differently from the way we traditionally did. And if you think about companies, for example, HMV or Virgin Music or EMI, that's exactly what they're having to learn how to do. And that has a huge impact on the way that we think about creating value. But in both cases, the value itself is no longer being created by controlling business processes or the products themselves. It's the ability to create hubs that address our consumer group. So even if we are selling records, the value of those records is no longer in the record themselves, but our ability to connect consumers to a large number of those through a hub. And typically that would be better done digitally than it would be done physically. So increasingly you're starting to see record shops become kind of showrooms for computer screens within the shop, where you can go in and actually select from the songs you're seeing screen and hearing, and the databases you can access. So it's becoming a kind of community center for kind of people that have that particular geeky behavior and interest, rather than what you and I, or people of my age, thought of as HMV or Virgin Record Shop. In more traditional markets, so for example, the garment industry, where, whatever I do, my trousers can't be replaced with something digital, thankfully. What you're kind of seeing is a change in not the product itself, but how the value of that product is created. So the value in clothes is increasingly shifting out of the hands of the retailer. The manufacturers have been, frankly, screwed by retailers for years anyway, so it's not going to them. And it's increasingly going into those firms that can aggregate the hub. So Amazon is making most of the money, or somebody else. And if you think about the book trade, this is increasingly the case. I mean, Amazon do not write books. They do not publish books. They very often don't distribute them. And yet the margin on many books that Amazon actually sell can be as much as 45%. And I say this as an aggrieved author myself. My take on a typical academic book is about 4%, significantly less than Amazon's. So what we need to be thinking about is, if we really want to position ourselves in a market, are we willing to be a price taker for an aggregator of value, or do we actually think that we can create more value by controlling that hub space? And if we can, how do we actually do that? Now, Amazon do that using their review system, where they actually get us to create the value for them. And all they do is provide a platform that makes us want to do it. But that's not the only way of doing it. Important is to think about how that can work. We can talk about that. It will take quite a long time, but I would suggest, if that is of interest to people, we simply do another session on that, where we talk about how that works and how it can be done. And if you're particularly interested, I'm writing a book about that right now. And I should say, and it's a pure selfish point, if any of you are interested in the things we talked about today, I did publish a book which I co-authored, which talks about exactly these issues and takes you through these articles in one chapter, and other parts of the book talks about how this process is leaving many people behind and what we might do about that as a society. Sorry, that's the pitch over now.
Andrew, I think you held your audience on Zoom exceptionally well. I can a lot of very familiar names on here. It's good to see you all, and some I don't know. You mentioned that some of your new students may see you for the first time on this platform. I think they're in for a treat when the term starts. But as you've offered to come and give us another presentation, I think we should take you up on that. So
I will say these things rashly, but on one condition, Neil. I'd like to be able to hold up my book from last year and blatantly pitch it, so that people can have the opportunity to go and give me their 4% on Amazon.
I thought you just had done that, but maybe.
No, actually, there you go. Actually, hold it up so you can actually see it.
Available on Amazon and in traditional format, I presume.
Yes, absolutely. It's a Routledge book, so you can get it on Amazon. You can get it a little bit cheaper, probably, if you go to the Routledge site. And if you're not sure, you can just contact me, and I can happily tell you where to get it.
Thank you.
As I say, I've got 2 books coming out next year, so I'd be more than happy to share the links of those when they come out.
I can see some very good feedback from participants on the group chat. Thank you all very much for that. I don't know how many we have watching us on Facebook Live. I think Anna can probably give us more news on that one. But I think this has been an extremely interesting help. We're over time, so an hour and a quarter on this one. Unless there are any final questions from anybody, until our second bite at the cherry, when Andrew comes to talk to us again. As he's now.
Yes, if I may, I do have a question. Hi, Andy. It's Ligia from Technical University of Cluj-Napoca. So my question is, from a consultant position, how to get managers to focus their attention in the complex space, while we know that during times of crisis, when people feel threatened, their cognitive abilities and attention tends to narrow, and they experience a frontal lobe shutdown. So how do you get them to look at the complex space?
Okay, so that's a very good question. Thank you. Typically, what I try to do is what I also try to do with my students across the various things I teach, and that is to move them through what I call the 3 thinking levels. So what managers typically do is they exhibit descriptive thinking, where they can accurately describe what's taking place. What I would do is to encourage them by helping provide them with analytical models to make sense of that descriptive reality and actually start spotting trends, because the models allow them to do that. And that's kind of what I've been doing today. But then what I try to do as well is to show them how they can use these models to gain critical insight into actually how value itself is being affected, created, and disrupted. And so then you get that strategic sort of stuff. And that's what I've been trying to show you with some of the examples and answering some of the questions as to how we might think about doing that. So, you know, I've done that with varying success. With the technology company I mentioned to you and the Big 4 firm, it seems to have been reasonably successful in communicating to people. With regards to the services company, it pretty much, despite a year of trying to convince people, I ultimately failed. And what I tried to do is use the existing data that the company considers to be legitimate and offer them recognized analytical models for interpreting that data and saying, well, you know, what's the explanation for the dissonance? How is best practice going to answer this? And if they can't find an answer to that, then say, well, perhaps we're not in the best practice box. Can we look at this in a different way so that you're not just totally overwhelming people? Sometimes people can grasp that, and sometimes it takes them a time. And in the end, you know, as frustrating as it is, some people simply can't make that leap. And, you know, of course, that's what economists famously call creative destruction.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Lygia.
I can say that Lygia is also going to be writing contributing to one of the books that's being published next year. So if you want to see Lygia in print, you will have that privilege with that book also on leadership, green leadership.
Good. Well, we're now 1/4 hour past your due time. Are there any other questions? I can't promise that we'll have another session with you, Andy, before you get out of quarantine in the UK. We've got another 11 days, I believe, so good luck with that.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you. We know where to find you now to talk about a second event like this. So thank you very much indeed today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you to Stefan and to Anna and Madalena and the Chamber team for organizing this. Just a reminder, we found one of the technical issues about not being able to listen to the speech you sent us the link for as part of this forum. That link has been circulated on the chat box. So I would encourage you all to find that. As far as I'm aware, once we close this session, the chat box will disappear. So I encourage you to look at that now and copy paste it into your browsers before it gets lost. Or otherwise, if you get in touch with the Chamber, I'm sure we can give you the details there. And there it is again. Thank you, Stefan. So if you want to get that, I'll do it now while we talk. So we're continuing, even though we're in August. We've had an excellent turnout today. Thank you all very much indeed. Anna, what are we doing next?
Thank you, Neil. Thank you again, Andrew, for the very qualitative webinar. We will have one more webinar until the end of summer, which will be next week on Monday morning, and it will be focused on our well-being, on how mindfulness can help our well-being and how we can resist stress. I'm also typing the registration link to this webinar, so if you are interested, again, you can just click on it and register. And just a quick mention about this webinar, we will have a surprise for all the participants in this webinar. So we are looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, before we go, we should also mention we actually have another face-to-face event coming, which will be on the 27th of August in Bucharest. Do you want to say anything about that, Anna?
Yes, we will have a face-to-face event together with the Austrian Embassy on the 27th of August, starting with 6 p.m. at their venue. I will also type here some details about this event. And if you are interested, just send me an email. We have just limited places because of the COVID-19 situation, of course. So if you are interested, just let me know and we'll see if we have more places available.
Yeah, just so everyone's in the same picture, we are applying protective measures and social distancing. We had a very successful first networking event in Bucharest at the end of last month with social distancing and protection, and this is the next step beyond there. We're not doing anything rash. Safety is, of course, paramount, but for the same level, we need to keep, or there's a demand among our members to keep seeing people and keep networking, even if you're going to be banging elbows with each other and wearing masks rather than doing what we do normally. I'm very pleased to say that the 27th of August event will be hosted by our Vice Chairman, Colin Lovering, as I shall be on holiday that day. So I wish you all a very good rest of August. I hope to see you, as many as possible of you, next week. And I'm sorry I won't be able to attend on the 27th, but I'm sure that Colin will give you all an extremely good evening as host of that event. Thank you all very much indeed. And I think on that basis, you've got all the links. Get those while you can. If you don't have time to get them, get in touch with Anna or Stefan or Madalena at the Chamber office. And keep well and keep successful in what I think are certainly complex times. Thank you again, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Andy. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.